In April 1979, the Hendricks County Co-op on Route 9 outside Danville, Indiana got a shipment that the manager, Dale Prewitt, called the biggest thing to hit farming in 20 years. He stood behind the counter with a glossy pamphlet in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other, telling every man who walked through the door the same thing before they even had their coats off. Agramax Complete Crop Nutrition Formula. Developed by researchers at a private agricultural lab in Columbus, Ohio. Pre-blended nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium with what the pamphlet called proprietary micronutrient enhancement. $42 a bag. Enough for 3 acres if you applied it right, the pamphlet said, though Dale admitted he hadn't tried it himself yet. By 9 in the morning, 16 farmers had bought it. By 11, the first pallet was half gone. Dale had already called his distributor for a second order. Then the door opened, and Raymond Schultz walked in. He was 61 years old that April, though most people in Hendricks County would have guessed older from the way he moved. Deliberate and unhurried, like a man who has learned that most things will wait for you if you don't panic. He had farmed the same 280 acres on Schultz Road since 1944, when his father handed him the deed and told him the land would tell him everything he needed to know if he listened more than he talked. Raymond had listened. For 35 years he had listened. He picked up the pamphlet from the stack Dale had laid on the counter. He read it. He turned it over and read the back. He set it down. Dale leaned forward. "Raymond, I'm telling you. Every serious operation in the county is going in on this. Dr. Weston from Purdue Extension came through last week, said the yield data out of Ohio was unlike anything he'd seen in a decade. We're talking 18% improvement on corn. Real numbers." Raymond looked at the price on the pamphlet again. $42. "I'll pass," he said. The 3 men standing at the counter, Pete Calloway from the big operation on State Road 36, his hired man Terry Wick, and Gerald Boone, who ran 500 acres of soybeans east of town, all turned to look at Raymond at the same time. Pete Calloway laughed first. It was a short, sharp sound, not unkind exactly, but not gentle either. "Raymond, $42 a bag is nothing if it does what they're saying. You're going to leave yield on the table over $42? "Not over the price," Raymond said. "I'm mixing my own." The silence that followed lasted about 2 seconds before Gerald Boone made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Pete shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head at something he has decided not to waste further energy arguing with. Terry Wick looked at the floor because he was young enough to still be embarrassed by second-hand foolishness. Dale set down his coffee. "Raymond, with all respect, what you can mix yourself in a barn isn't going to touch what these people formulated in a laboratory. This is science." Raymond nodded once, the way he always nodded, as if he was filing the information in a drawer he would check later. He bought 2 spools of baling wire, a can of chain oil, and a box of staples. He paid in cash. He said good morning to everyone, meaning it, and he left. Pete Calloway watched the truck pull out onto Route 9. It was a 1961 Ford F-100, blue, with one dented rear fender that had been dented since 1968 and would apparently remain dented until the truck itself gave out, which showed no sign of happening. "That man," Pete said, not finishing the sentence because the sentence didn't need finishing. By the end of that week, nearly every working farm in the county with more than 100 acres had bought at least 3 bags of Agramax. The co-op sold through the second pallet and ordered a third. Dale Prewitt was in a good mood every morning for 2 weeks straight. The conversations at the counter and in the parking lot had the particular excitement of people who believe they are ahead of something. Raymond Schultz, and 3 miles away on Schultz Road, was in his barn. Now, to understand what he was doing in that barn, you need to understand something about Raymond that most people in Hendricks County understood only in the way you understand a man you've watched for years without ever quite seeing. His father, Clarence Schultz, had come to this land in 1931, in the middle of everything falling apart, and had managed to hold it through the Depression by doing something that the neighbors thought was eccentric, and turned out to be salvation. Clarence had kept a notebook, not a diary, not a journal, a working notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover that cost 15 cents at the dime store. In it, he recorded everything: what he planted and where, what the soil looked like in his hand after rain, what he fed it and what it gave back. He recorded failures the same way he recorded successes, without drama, just the facts and the date and whatever he thought explained the outcome. When Raymond was 12, his father handed him his own notebook and told him to start keeping records. Raymond had kept records for 49 years without missing a single growing season. By 1979, he had 11 of those notebooks, stacked on a shelf in the barn above the workbench. They covered his soil like a medical chart covers a patient. He knew what his north field needed that his south field didn't. He knew that his ground ran low on boron after a wet spring and needed calcium when he'd pushed it hard the year before. He knew because he had tested it, season after season, with basic soil tests he sent to the county extension office and later to Purdue. And he had built his fertility program around those tests the way a doctor builds a treatment around blood work. His own mix, the one that made Pete Calloway and Gerald Boone and half the county quietly dismiss him as a relic, cost him roughly $8 per acre to apply in 1979. It was not a recipe he had invented all at once. It had evolved over 30 years of observation, adjustment, and failure. It was ammonium nitrate at a rate his soil tests called for, not a rate printed on a national pamphlet designed for average ground across 6 states. It was superphosphate calibrated to what his specific fields were actually short of. It was potash dialed in the same way, with wood ash from his own burn pile folded in each fall because he'd learned from his father's notebooks that his particular clay subsoil responded to it in a way the extension bulletins didn't specifically address, but the results confirmed every year. He also added at a rate that made the agronomists at the county extension office raise their eyebrows when he first mentioned it in the early 1960s, a homemade compost blend that he worked into his heavier ground every 3rd year. They had raised their eyebrows then. They had stopped raising their eyebrows by 1970 because his yields had stopped giving them a reason to. But the county didn't follow yield data the way they followed conversation at the co-op, and in 1979 the conversation at the co-op was all Agramax. Spring planting went in across Hendricks County in the 2nd and 3rd weeks of May. The weather cooperated: warm nights, good moisture, none of the late frost that had hurt the southern part of the state in 1978. Pete Calloway put Agramax down on all 480 acres of his corn ground. Gerald Boone used it on his bean fields along with his corn. 17 other operations ranging from 80 to 800 acres followed the application rates on the pamphlet and waited. Raymond Schultz planted the same week, mixed his blend in the same battered spreader his father had bought in 1953, and did not wait for any particular outcome because he already knew what his ground was going to do. He had done this before. He would do it again. By the middle of June, the corn was standing. Everyone's corn was standing. That much was true. And the county had the kind of June that made farmers relax slightly. Not enough to say anything optimistic out loud, because you never said anything optimistic out loud before July 4th, but enough to feel it. Then the summer turned. It turned the way Indiana summers will turn if you live here long enough to have seen it happen before, which not everyone who bought Agramax pamphlets had. July came in hot and dry. Not catastrophically dry, not 1988 dry, not burn the crop dry, but the persistent, grinding kind of dry that doesn't make the news, but quietly pulls everything that isn't deeply rooted toward stress. 2 weeks without meaningful rain, then 3. The soil cracked along the rows in Pete Calloway's fields, first because Pete had been pushing his ground hard for years and the organic matter was thin. And thin organic matter in a dry July means you watch your corn start to show it. Pete walked his fields on a Thursday in late July and looked at what he had. The corn was tasseling, which was on schedule, but the leaves were rolling. Not catastrophically, not dead field rolling, but rolling by mid-morning, which meant the roots were working harder than they should have been at this stage and getting less back than they needed. He called Dale Prewitt. Dale called the Agramax distributor. The distributor sent a representative named Tom Hafer down from Indianapolis, a young man in a company truck with a clipboard who walked Pete's fields for 2 hours and told him the application rate might need adjustment for heat stress years and that the company was developing a supplemental product for exactly this situation. The supplemental product was not available yet. By August 1st, Pete Calloway's corn was not going to be what the pamphlet had suggested. He knew it. He just didn't know yet by how much. Gerald Boone's beans were a similar story. The Agramax formula was designed for what the pamphlet called average seasonal conditions, and this July was not average. The micronutrient enhancement, whatever exactly that was, since the pamphlet was not specific, had pushed early vegetative growth hard, which looked impressive in June and became a liability in dry July when the plant needed reserves it had already spent. By the second week of August, a different kind of conversation was happening at the co-op. Quieter, less certain. The kind of conversation where men look at the floor more than usual. Dale Prewitt was still maintaining that the results would come back at harvest, that one hard July didn't undo the science. Tom Hafer from Agramax sent a letter to the county's larger accounts saying yield projections were being recalibrated for heat stress regions. Nobody said the word failure out loud yet. It's very difficult to say that word out loud before harvest. Raymond Schultz's corn was doing something different. His neighbor to the east, a quiet man named Carl Dieter, who ran a modest operation and kept to himself, had been watching Raymond's fields across the fence line through the whole dry stretch. He mentioned it to his wife on a Sunday evening without making a fuss about it. Just said that Raymond's ground was holding up better than anything he'd seen for a quarter mile in any direction. The leaves weren't rolling the same way. The color was holding. Carl couldn't explain it except that Raymond's ground always seemed to hold moisture better than ground that looked identical from the road. The reason, though Carl Dieter didn't know the specific reason and Raymond never held a lecture about it, was 30 years of compost and organic matter built into the soil profile to a depth that commercial blends applied from a pamphlet for 3 seasons could not replicate. Organic matter holds water. Every point of organic matter percentage in a soil profile holds roughly an additional 20,000 gallons of water per acre. Raymond's fields, built up since his father's time with the kind of patient feeding that doesn't show results in 1 season or 3, but compounds over decades. Were sitting on a biological reserve that had nothing to do with what was in the Agramax formula. He had not built it to defeat Agramax. He had built it because his father's notebook from 1934 contained an entry that said, in Clarence Schultz's careful handwriting, ground that feeds itself in the dry years is the only ground worth farming. Raymond had read that sentence when he was 14. He had not forgotten it. Harvest that fall confirmed what August had suggested. Pete Calloway pulled 142 bushels per acre on his best ground, down from the 170 he'd projected in June, and down from the 165 he'd averaged the 3 years before going heavy on Agramax. He did not advertise this number. Gerald Boone's beans came in at 38 bushels, respectable by some standards, disappointing by his own. Several smaller operations came in at yields they declined to discuss at the co-op. Raymond Schultz pulled 168 bushels per acre on his corn ground, which was 3 bushels above his 5-year average, and which he also did not advertise because he had not built his farm on advertising. But Hendricks County was not a large county, and numbers travel in a small county the way weather travels. You don't have to send it anywhere, it just arrives. By November, the numbers had arrived at the co-op, the diner on the square, the church parking lots, and the feed store on the south end of town. People put them together without being told to. Pete Calloway heard the comparison for the first time from his brother-in-law at Thanksgiving, stated as a simple fact with no particular malice, and spent the rest of that afternoon quieter than usual. He drove out to Schultz Road the following Monday. It was a cold morning, the fields stripped and gray, the sky the color of old tin. Raymond was in the barn doing what Raymond was always doing when there was nothing pressing, maintaining equipment, working through his off-season list, moving at the same unhurried pace he moved at in April and August and every month between. Pete Calloway was not a man who apologized easily. He had grown up in a family where acknowledging error was roughly equivalent to revealing a physical weakness, and he had run a large farm for 20 years in a community where being right mattered in proportion to how many acres you commanded. Walking into Raymond's barn that Monday morning was not a comfortable thing for him to do. He did it anyway. Raymond saw him come in. He set down the wrench he was holding. He did not say anything, which was his habit, and which Pete had always found faintly unsettling and now found oddly settling, like the ground wasn't going to shift under him any further than it already had. "I came out to tell you something," Pete said. He looked around the barn for a moment, at the old equipment, the notebooks on the shelf, the spreader that had been old when Pete was young. "I was wrong to laugh." Raymond looked at him steadily. "At the co-op in April," Pete said, "when you said you'd mix your own. I laughed. I want you to know I know that was wrong." Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You bought what they were selling, Pete. That's not a character flaw." "I bought what sounded smart," Pete said. "Yours sounded old." Raymond considered that. "It is old," he said. "My father built this ground starting in 1931. I've been feeding it since 1944. What's in that soil isn't in a formula they designed in Columbus. It's in 30 years of knowing exactly what this particular piece of ground needs and giving it that, not what the pamphlet says an average acre needs." Pete looked at the notebooks on the shelf. "What are those?" "Records," Raymond said. "Every season since my father started keeping them." Pete was quiet for a long moment. "I don't have anything like that." "No," Raymond said without cruelty. "Most don't." He handed Pete a cup of coffee from the thermos on the workbench. They stood in the barn in the cold morning, and Pete Calloway did not try to qualify what he had said or walk it back or turn it into a lesson about something else. He had come to say he was wrong, and he had said it, and Raymond had received it without theater and without scorekeeping, and somehow that made it worse and better at the same time. Pete looked at the old spreader. It was a 1953 John Deere Van Brunt, patched in 2 places on the hopper, with a chain drive that Raymond kept meticulously adjusted. "You still using that thing?" "Every season," Raymond said. "It works." "Doesn't need to be new to work," Raymond said. "Just needs to be right." That was the sentence Pete Calloway repeated at his kitchen table 2 days later when he was telling his wife about it. It was the sentence she remembered. It was the sentence that ended up, through the ordinary channels of a small county, at the co-op and the diner, and eventually, improbably, printed in a small box in the Hendricks County Flyers year-end agricultural roundup under a headline that someone at the paper thought captured the fall's main story. Dale Prewitt ordered significantly less Agramax for 1980. He did not stop carrying it. There were still farmers who believed in it, and some operations that had used it without the same July stress and had done reasonably well. But he ordered less. He also, for the first time in his tenure at the co-op, set up a basic soil testing service at the counter in partnership with the Purdue Extension Office, which he had previously considered unnecessary, given that product companies generally told you what to apply without the extra step of asking what your ground actually needed. He told his wife that winter that he thought he'd been more of a salesman than he should have been, which was the most honest thing Dale Prewitt had said about himself in a long time, and which his wife received without comment, because she had thought so for years. Raymond Schultz went back to his farm and his notebooks and his routine. He tested his soil in October, as he did every October. He adjusted his blend for the following year based on what the tests showed, as he did every year. He noted in his November entry that the dry July had cost him nothing because the ground held, and that this was consistent with what the records showed in 1953, in 1964, and in 1971, the last 3 times a dry stretch had hit during the critical period. The ground had held each time. He had built it to hold. He also noted in the same careful handwriting he'd had since his father taught him to keep records, and that 3 neighbors had asked him in November about his soil program. He had told all 3 of them the same thing. Start with a soil test, not a pamphlet. Build organic matter the slow way, which was the only way it actually built. Keep records the way a doctor keeps records, because your ground is a patient, and you need to know its history to treat it well. Whether they followed the advice he did not record, because that was not his to know. The following spring, Pete Calloway came back to ask about soil testing. He sat at Raymond's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad and asked questions for 2 hours, the kind of questions a man asks when he has decided to stop being embarrassed about what he doesn't know. Raymond answered every question without making it feel like a lesson. By the end of it, Pete had a list of things to do before planting that had nothing to do with what any company pamphlet had suggested. He tested his soil for the first time in his 20 years of farming. The results, when they came back from the extension office, told him things about his fields he had not known. Specific deficiencies, specific imbalances, a phosphorus situation in his east ground that explained a yield problem he'd been blaming on weather for 4 years. He read the results the way Raymond had told him to read them, which was as facts to respond to, not as verdicts to argue with. His 1980 crop, with a more precisely targeted fertility program and a July that turned out to be wet rather than dry, came in at 178 bushels per acre. This was not entirely due to the new approach. The weather was better. But the approach was better too, and he knew the difference. He called Raymond in October to tell him the number. "Good ground will do that," Raymond said, which was all he said. Gerald Boone took another year to come around. He remained loyal to Agramax through 1980, which was a better year for it than 1979 had been, and pulled acceptable numbers. But in 1981, another dry stretch hit in late July, not as bad as 1979, but enough. And the difference between his fields and Raymond's fields across the county showed up in the numbers again. By November of 1981, Gerald Boone had a soil testing appointment with the Purdue Extension Office and a new notebook on his kitchen table with the first entry written in it. He was 62 years old when he started keeping records. He told his son that it was the most useful thing he'd done in farming since buying his first good tractor, which was a thing his son wrote down somewhere and later repeated to his own children. Raymond Schultz kept farming Schultz Road through the 1980s and into the 1990s. He did not expand. He did not modernize beyond what the work required. He bought a used 1968 International Harvester grain truck in 1981 when his previous truck gave out, because a 1968 truck would do what he needed a truck to do, and there was no reason to pay more for the same function in a newer body. He kept his records. He kept his blend. He kept his spreader oiled and adjusted. In 1987, the County Extension Office invited him to speak at their annual Farmer Education Day. He declined. He sent them instead a copy of his father's formula for soil amendment documentation, not his specific blend, which was calibrated to his specific ground and wouldn't directly apply to anyone else's, but the method of thinking that underlay it. Test first, apply to the test, record the result, adjust the following year. Repeat until you understand the relationship between what you feed the ground and what the ground gives back. The extension agent who received it, a younger man named Richard Holt, who had come up through the university system and was more comfortable with company data than with handwritten notebooks, read it twice. He used the framework in his next 3 county presentations without attribution, which Raymond would never have known about and would not have minded if he had. In 1994, Raymond turned 76. His son David, who had been working the farm alongside him since 1978, and who had kept his own notebooks since Raymond handed him a marbled cover one on his 14th birthday, took over the day-to-day operation that spring. The handoff was not ceremonial. Raymond was there every day through planting. He walked the fields the same way he'd always walked them. He just let David make the calls. On a September afternoon that year, Raymond walked David to the barn and showed him, as he had shown him many times before but now with a different weight to the showing, the shelf where the notebooks lived. 11 of Raymond's, 2 of Clarence's before him, David's own 6, lined up beside them. "These are the farm," Raymond said. He didn't say it dramatically. He said it the way he said most things, as a plain fact that didn't need decoration. David nodded. He understood that the land and the notebooks were inseparable, that one without the other was just dirt and just paper, and that together they were something that no pamphlet developed in a laboratory in Columbus, Ohio, could reproduce, because it had taken 60 years to write, and the soil had done the reading. Raymond started each morning on the farm through 1996 before his knees made the barn steps a negotiation rather than a habit. By then, David had 2 sons of his own, teenagers, the older one already asking questions that showed he was paying attention. The 1953 John Deere spreader was still in the barn, still adjusted, still used. Not every season by then. David had added equipment as the operation required, but still turned over, still maintained, and still pulled out for the heavy clay ground on the north end where the newer spreader ran wide and the old one ran precise. Some tools stay because they're sentimental. Some stay because nothing newer has gotten better at the specific job they do. Raymond's spreader stayed for the second reason. In 2003, David's oldest son, Raymond's grandson, also named Clarence, for the man whose notebooks started everything, faced a situation that rhymed with 1979 in ways that made David smile in a way that was not quite sadness and not quite pride, but somewhere between them. A new soil amendment product was coming through the co-op. Different company, different formula, same glossy pamphlet energy. Several neighbors were going in on it. Clarence read the pamphlet the way his grandfather had read it. Turned it over, read the back, set it down. He went to the barn shelf. He pulled out the notebooks, all of them, going back to the one Clarence, the first, had started in 1931. He sat with them for an afternoon, not reading every word, but reading the pattern. The years where the ground held, the years where it struggled, the reasons, the adjustments, the slow, patient accumulation of knowledge that was specific to this ground and no other ground in Hendricks County or anywhere else. He mixed his own blend. It cost him roughly $11 an acre by 2003 prices, which, by the same rough proportion, held against the competition's $48 formula, about the way $8 had held against 42 in 1979. His yield that year was 192 bushels per acre on the corn ground. It was the highest the farm had ever recorded. He wrote it in his notebook on the last evening of harvest, sitting at the same kitchen table where his grandfather had once sat across from Pete Calloway, and explained in the plainest words he could find what 30 years of listening to a specific piece of ground will teach you that no laboratory can formulate. The entry was brief. Date, yield, conditions, blend used, result. Then one line at the bottom, written in the same deliberate handwriting the Schultz men had always used in their notebooks, carrying forward without interruption the record that Clarence I had started in a year when everything was falling apart and the only reliable thing left was the ground beneath your feet and the honesty to pay attention to what it was telling you. The line said, "Ground held again. Some knowledge cannot be purchased. It can only be built season by season by people patient enough to keep records and humble enough to let the ground teach them what no pamphlet ever will."